May 14, 1941, 11:30 p.m., Brussels, Belgium, a safe house on Rue des Atrabes. Leopold Trepper sat before a radio transmitter, whose vacuum tubes cast a faint orange glow across a room that smelled of tobacco smoke, solder flux, and the particular mustiness of curtains that had not been opened in weeks. His fingers moved across cipher tables with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent years converting secrets into number groups, transforming intelligence that might save nations into strings of digits that would travel through the night air to receivers in Moscow, whose operators would decode them, transcribe them, and forward them to offices where decisions were made about what the information meant and whether it mattered. Trepper was 37 years old, a Polish Jew from Nowy Targ who had worked as a locksmith before discovering that his talents for mechanism and patience applied equally well to the construction of intelligence networks. He had become a communist in the 1920s, had organized workers in Palestine, had served Soviet intelligence in various capacities across Europe for over a decade. The network he now commanded was called the Red Orchestra by the German counterintelligence officers who would eventually hunt it, a name that reflected the musical precision with which its various components transmitted their intelligence to Moscow. Trepper preferred to think of it as a machine whose parts he had assembled with a craftsman's attention to function and reliability. The message he was encoding tonight contained information that had cost months of careful cultivation to obtain. German troop dispositions along the Soviet frontier, unit identifications that documented the buildup whose scale exceeded any defensive requirement, timetables whose specificity suggested not preparation for possible conflict, but preparation for imminent attack. His sources included contacts in German commercial firms whose business brought them into contact with military logistics, railway officials whose cargo manifests revealed what the Wehrmacht was moving eastward, and agents whose positions within German-occupied Europe provided access to planning documents whose contents left no ambiguity about German intentions. The message would join dozens of others that Trepper had transmitted over the preceding months, each one adding detail to a picture whose outlines had been clear since winter. Germany was preparing to invade the Soviet Union. The invasion would come in summer when weather permitted the mobile operations that German doctrine emphasized. The attack would aim for Moscow, Leningrad, and the Ukrainian industrial regions whose capture would cripple Soviet war-making capacity. The information was precise enough to permit defensive preparations whose implementation might save millions of lives. The information was being ignored. Trepper understood that his reports were not reaching the men who might act upon them, or were reaching those men in forms that permitted inaction. The responses he received from Moscow were bureaucratic acknowledgments that confirmed receipt without indicating comprehension, formulaic replies whose blandness suggested either indifference or the particular caution of officials who understood that accurate intelligence might be unwelcome intelligence. He had learned through years of service that Soviet intelligence operated within constraints that had nothing to do with the quality of information gathered, and everything to do with the political environment within which that information was processed. The purges that had consumed Soviet military and intelligence leadership between 1937 and 1939 had eliminated men whose competence had included the willingness to present conclusions that contradicted official expectations. Their replacements had learned different lessons about what accuracy cost and what compliance preserved. A report suggesting that Germany planned to attack violated Stalin's conviction that Hitler would not risk a two-front war. Presenting such reports required either courage that might prove fatal or annotations that transformed warnings into ambiguities whose interpretation could be adjusted to match whatever reality eventually emerged. Trepper finished encoding the message and handed it to his radio operator, a young man whose technical skills exceeded his understanding of what the skills were being used to accomplish. The transmission would take approximately 12 minutes, long enough that German direction-finding equipment might detect its origin if the listeners were alert and the equipment was properly calibrated. The risk was acceptable because the information was important. The importance was theoretical because the information would not be used. Trepper lit a cigarette and waited for confirmation that Moscow had received another warning that Moscow would not heed. May 17, 1941, 3:45 p.m. Moscow, NKGB headquarters, Lubyanka Square. Pavel Mikhailovich Fitin sat at a desk covered with intelligence summaries whose accumulation documented either the most successful espionage operation in Soviet history or the most elaborate deception campaign German intelligence had ever mounted. The office smelled of paper that had passed through too many hands, tobacco from the cigarettes he chain-smoked through working hours that began before dawn and ended after midnight, and something else beneath those familiar odors, the particular institutional scent of a building where fear had become architectural, embedded in the walls and floors and furniture by generations of men whose tenure in these offices ended in the basement cells whose purpose everyone understood and no one discussed. Fitin was 34 years old, a former agricultural engineer from a village near Yekaterinburg whose path to directing Soviet foreign intelligence had been paved by the corpses of men more qualified than himself. He had joined the NKVD in 1938, had been promoted with a speed that reflected not his abilities, though his abilities were genuine, but the vacancies that the purges had created in positions whose previous occupants had been executed for crimes that existed only in the confessions extracted through methods practiced in the basement below. His predecessors had been shot. Their predecessors had been shot. The pattern suggested conclusions about his own future that Fitin had learned not to contemplate during working hours. The report from Brussels lay on top of the stack, Trepper's latest transmission decoded and transcribed by analysts whose annotations reflected the caution that survival required. The information was specific. German forces were concentrating in occupied Poland in numbers that exceeded 3 million men, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, positioned for offensive operations whose timing would coincide with favorable weather in late June. The source was reliable, the methodology was sound, the conclusion was unmistakable. Germany intended to attack the Soviet Union within weeks. Beside Trepper's report lay intelligence from Richard Sorge in Tokyo, whose access to German diplomatic communications had produced warnings whose precision matched what the Red Orchestra was providing from Europe. Sorge had transmitted the date, June 22nd. He had transmitted German strategic objectives. He had transmitted his assessment that the attack was certain, not contingent on negotiations or provocations or any of the diplomatic maneuvers that might permit last-minute avoidance. The information was corroborated by sources in Berlin, by agents in Romania and Hungary whose governments were coordinating with German military planning, by defectors whose testimony confirmed what espionage had revealed. Fitin counted the warnings as he prepared his summary for the deputy commissar who would determine what reached Stalin's desk. 84 separate reports predicting German attack had arrived through his directorate since January. The reports came from networks whose construction had required years of patient labor by men whose professionalism would ultimately prove irrelevant to their fates. Anatoly Gurevich had arrived in Brussels in April 1939, traveling under documents that identified him as a Uruguayan businessman named Vicente Sierra, carrying credentials whose authenticity had been established through months of preparatory work that created the commercial identity behind which his intelligence activities would shelter. The city smelled of rain and coal smoke and the particular heaviness of European spring, familiar enough to a man who grew up in Leningrad, but foreign in ways that required constant attention to details whose mishandling might prove fatal. Gurevich was 26 years old, a former student at Leningrad's Institute of Foreign Trade, whose language abilities and ideological reliability had attracted the attention of recruiters whose proposition seemed romantic to a young man whose understanding of intelligence work derived from novels rather than experience. He had been trained in Moscow through a curriculum that emphasized tradecraft over ideology, that taught him to construct cover identities whose depth could withstand investigation, to establish communication protocols whose redundancy ensured that no single failure would compromise entire networks, to cultivate sources through relationships whose authenticity made the manipulation underlying them invisible to their targets. The cover business that sheltered his activities was a raincoat export company whose actual commercial operations provided legitimacy that pure fronts could not sustain. Gurevich learned to think like the businessman he pretended to be, to discuss fabric weights and shipping schedules and profit margins with the fluency of a man whose livelihood depended on such knowledge. The deception required not merely memorization, but internalization, the construction of a second self whose existence was complete enough to survive the casual scrutiny of customs officials, business contacts, and the neighbors whose observations might reach authorities if inconsistencies attracted attention. Leopold Trepper had recruited him into the Red Orchestra's Belgian operations, had recognized in the young man abilities that the network required: linguistic competence in French and German, commercial instincts that made the cover business credible, and the particular combination of patience and boldness that intelligence work demanded. Gurevich became one of the network's most productive agents, cultivating sources whose access to German military information would prove invaluable when the war expanded to include the Soviet Union. He recruited sub-agents through methods that balanced operational security against the need for human contact that recruitment required. The methods that made Soviet networks effective reflected lessons learned through decades of clandestine operations, institutional knowledge that survived the purges even as the men who embodied it had not. Compartmentalization ensured that captured agents could betray only the fragments they knew, not the networks whose full extent remained invisible to any individual member. Multiple communication channels provided redundancy that permitted continued operation when German direction-finding equipment located and eliminated particular transmitters. Deep cover identities established over years rather than months created legends whose investigation would reveal the businessman or journalist that agents pretended to be, rather than the intelligence officers they actually were. Gurevich understood that the professionalism characterizing his work existed in tension with the system that directed it. The same Soviet state that had trained him in tradecraft had executed the instructors whose expertise that training reflected. The same intelligence apparatus that deployed him to Brussels had consumed the officers whose experience had built the networks he now served. He operated within a structure whose internal contradictions were visible to anyone who examined them closely. Contradictions between the competence that operations required and the terror that the regime imposed on the men whose competence made operations possible. The reports he gathered through 1940 and into 1941 documented German preparations whose implications were unmistakable to anyone whose analysis was not constrained by political requirements. He transmitted intelligence about German deployments, about logistics movements that revealed operational intentions, about conversations overheard in commercial contexts where German officers spoke more freely than security should have permitted. Each transmission represented risk whose acceptance reflected commitment to a cause that would reward his service with imprisonment. The irony would become apparent only later, when the system he served with exceptional courage demonstrated that courage was not a quality it valued in men whose intelligence it could not use. June 16, 1941, 2:15 a.m. Brussels, the safe house on Rue d'Atrabat. Leopold Trepper's hands trembled slightly as he encoded the message that would constitute his most urgent warning yet, a tremor that reflected not fear, but the accumulated exhaustion of weeks during which sleep had become a luxury that operational demands prohibited. The room smelled of stale coffee, cigarette ash, and the electrical odor of radio equipment that had been operating continuously as the network's transmissions increased in frequency to match the acceleration of German preparations visible across occupied Europe. The intelligence had arrived through channels whose reliability Trepper had verified through years of cultivation, sources whose access to German military planning had been confirmed by the accuracy of previous reports. Railway officials documented the eastward movement of rolling stock, whose cargo manifests listed ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies in quantities that peacetime exercises never required. Commercial contacts reported conversations with German officers whose leave had been canceled and whose correspondence home had ceased, the communication blackout that preceded major operations. Diplomatic sources noted the evacuation of German dependents from Moscow, a precaution whose meaning required no interpretation for anyone whose analysis was not constrained by conclusions already determined. Trepper had been transmitting such warnings for months, watching the intelligence he gathered disappear into the silence that Moscow maintained regardless of what he reported. The acknowledgments that returned through the radio link confirmed receipt without indicating response, bureaucratic formulas whose blandness suggested either incomprehension or the careful neutrality of officials who understood responding substantively to warnings Stalin had rejected might prove professionally fatal. He continued transmitting because transmission was his function, because the alternative was accepting that the network he had built served no purpose, because some fragment of hope suggested that eventually the accumulation of evidence might overwhelm the political constraints that prevented its acceptance. 6,000 kilometers to the east, Pavel Fitin processed the flood of intelligence that June had produced with the methodical attention of a man documenting his own potential prosecution. The reports covered his desk in stacks whose organization reflected source rather than content, each stack representing a network whose warnings converged on identical conclusions through independent channels whose agreement should have eliminated any possibility of coordinated deception. Trepper's Red Orchestra, Sword's Tokyo network, the Berlin sources who operated under extraordinary danger, agents in Romania, Hungary, Finland, whose governments were coordinating with German military planning in ways that suggested imminent participation in operations against the Soviet Union. 84 separate warnings had accumulated since January, each one processed through the analytical machinery that Fitin commanded, each one annotated with the qualifications that survival required. The annotations transformed certainty into possibility, transformed warnings into assessments, transformed intelligence into the bureaucratic ambiguity that permitted superiors to reach whatever conclusions politics demanded. Fitin understood that his annotations were burying information that might save millions of lives. He also understood that presenting that information without annotations might cost his own life without changing the conclusions that Stalin had already reached. The system through which his reports traveled had been designed to produce compliance rather than accuracy. Each level of review added qualifications that diluted urgency, transformed specific warnings into general assessments, converted intelligence into the pablum that risk-averse officials could forward without committing themselves to conclusions whose incorrectness might later be prosecuted. A report stating that Germany would attack on June 22 became a report suggesting that some sources indicated possible German hostile intentions that might materialize under certain conditions. The transformation was not falsification, it was institutional self-protection, the bureaucratic immune response that prevented dangerous information from reaching decision-makers whose response to such information was unpredictable. Trepper finished his encoding his warning and handed it to his radio operator. knowing that the transmission would join the archive of ignored intelligence whose accuracy would become apparent only after the accuracy no longer mattered. Fitin filed his summary with annotations whose careful ambiguity would protect him from accusations of either alarmism or negligence, depending on which accusation subsequent events made convenient. Both men were performing their functions within a system that had made their functions meaningless. The intelligence they gathered was genuine. The warnings they transmitted were accurate. The system that received their work had decided in advance what conclusions were acceptable, and acceptable conclusions did not include the possibility that Stalin's assessment of German intentions might be wrong. June 22, 1941, 4:30 a.m. Brussels, Leopold Trepper's apartment on Avenue Richard Nyberg. The sound that woke him was not artillery or aircraft, but the ringing of a telephone whose urgency at this hour could mean only catastrophe or confirmation. The room smelled of the summer dawn filtering through windows he had left open against the June heat, mixed with the tobacco residue that permeated every space he occupied. He lifted the receiver knowing already what the message would contain, understanding before the words reached him that the warnings he had transmitted for months had finally been proven accurate in the worst possible way. The German invasion had begun 3 hours earlier, 3 million soldiers crossing the Soviet frontier along an 1,800-kilometer front, achieving the surprise that 84 separate intelligence warnings should have made impossible. The voice on the telephone belonged to a contact whose position permitted access to German military communications, a source whose information over the coming years would prove invaluable, but whose immediate report documented only that everything Trepper had predicted was now occurring exactly as he had predicted it. The date was correct, the objectives were correct, the scale was correct. The warnings were accurate, the warnings had been ignored. Trepper replaced the receiver and sat in the darkness of his apartment, processing the implications of what the invasion meant for the network he commanded and the country it served. The Red Orchestra's pre-war function was strategic warning, the provision of intelligence that might have permitted defensive preparations whose implementation could have blunted the assault now consuming Soviet forces along the frontier. That function had failed not through any inadequacy of the intelligence gathered, but through the system's inability to use what gathering had produced. The network's wartime function would be different. Operational intelligence that might help commanders whose forces had survived the initial catastrophe fight back against the enemy whose intentions they had not been permitted to anticipate. He began reorganizing the network for wartime operations that same morning, establishing new communication protocols, activating dormant agents whose cover required preservation for circumstances that had now arrived, redirecting collection priorities toward the German military information that Soviet commanders would need to understand what they were fighting. The intelligence that flowed through Red Orchestra channels over the following months would demonstrate what the network might have accomplished if the system had permitted its pre-war warnings to matter, would prove that the men Trepper commanded possessed capabilities that political constraints had rendered irrelevant until political constraints no longer applied. The wartime intelligence successes accumulated through 1941 and into 1942 with a consistency that validated every investment the network represented. Trepper's sources provided advance warning of German offensive operations, timetables whose accuracy permitted Soviet commanders to prepare defenses that pre-war warnings had not been allowed to enable. Order of battle information documented German unit dispositions with precision that permitted targeting by Soviet forces whose counterattacks benefited from knowledge that espionage had provided. Strategic assessments traced German intentions through the decision-making channels that Trepper's agents had penetrated, intelligence whose value commanders recognized even as they remained ignorant of how it had been obtained. The transformation in Moscow's response was visible in the acknowledgments that now accompanied network transmissions. Where pre-war reports had produced bureaucratic formulas whose blandness suggested indifference, wartime reports produced requests for additional detail, for clarification of points whose operational implications commanders were actively considering, for the continued flow of intelligence whose utility had been discovered only after the catastrophe that its earlier suppression had enabled. Pavel Fitin processed these responses with the bitter satisfaction of a man whose warnings had been vindicated at a cost measured in millions of lives, whose professional competence had been demonstrated through the failure of the system to use what his competence had produced. The Red Orchestra's wartime operations proved that Soviet intelligence possessed capabilities matching any service in the world, that the networks constructed through years of patient cultivation could provide information whose accuracy and timeliness met the most demanding operational requirements. The proof arrived too late to prevent the catastrophe that accurate intelligence might have averted, too late for the soldiers dying in encirclements that forewarning might have prevented, too late for the cities burning under bombardments that dispersal might have mitigated. The networks functioned, the agents performed. The system that commanded them had simply decided before the war began that their function and performance did not matter. November 24, 1942, 10:45 p.m., Marseille, France, a café on the Rue de la République. Leopold Trepper sat across from a man whose face he had memorized from German counterintelligence files, a Sonderkommando officer whose assignment was the destruction of everything Trepper had built. The café smelled of weak coffee, cigarette smoke, and the particular tension that accumulated when predator and prey occupied the same space, and both understood what the encounter meant. The German had been tracking the Red Orchestra for 18 months, following transmissions through direction-finding equipment whose precision had improved steadily as German technicians learned the frequencies and schedules that networks employed. Trepper had walked into the trap because the alternative was abandoning agents whose survival depended on his continued operation. The arrest ended 2 years of successful evasion, of safe houses abandoned hours before German raids arrived, of identities discarded when cover began to thin, of the constant movement that operational security demanded from a man whose face appeared on wanted posters throughout occupied Europe. The Germans had rolled up the Red Orchestra systematically through 1942, identifying transmitters through radio direction finding, capturing operators whose interrogation revealed cell structures that compartmentalization had been designed to protect, following threads whose unraveling consumed the network that Trepper had spent years constructing. Anatoly Gurevich had been captured in Marseille 9 days earlier, arrested in a café similar to the one where Trepper now sat, detained by Sonderkommando officers whose patience had been rewarded by months of surveillance whose target had finally made the mistake that surveillance required. The interrogation that followed occurred in facilities whose methods the Gestapo had refined through years of practice, rooms whose smell Gurevich would remember for the rest of his life, disinfectant failing to mask blood, sweat concentrated by fear, and the particular odor of electricity applied to human flesh. He had resisted for hours that stretched into days, had protected information whose revelation would have compromised agents still operating, had finally broken when the body's capacity to absorb pain exceeded the will's capacity to endure it. The Germans proposed an arrangement whose logic reflected their understanding of how intelligence networks functioned and how captured agents might be exploited. Gurevich would continue transmitting to Moscow, sending messages whose content the Germans controlled, participating in the radio game that counterintelligence called Funkspiel, the manipulation of enemy communications for deception purposes. The alternative was death, not the quick death of execution, but the slow death of continued interrogation whose endpoint would be reached only when the body ceased to function. Gurevich accepted because acceptance was survival, because the messages he would send might be recognized as controlled, because some possibility of eventual escape or liberation remained as long as he remained alive. The Funkspiel that followed demonstrated both German sophistication and Soviet vulnerability. The transmission of false intelligence through channels that Moscow continued trusting despite indicators that should have prompted suspicion. Messages from captured networks reported German weaknesses that did not exist, documented opportunities that were actually traps, provided the disinformation that German strategic deception required. The Soviet handlers who received these transmissions either failed to recognize the signs of control or recognized them and could not act on recognition without explaining to superiors why networks they had supervised had been compromised. Trepper's captivity followed different patterns than Gurevich's, his value as network commander warranting treatment that common agents did not receive. The Germans wanted information about Soviet intelligence structure, about networks beyond the Red Orchestra whose existence Trepper's position might allow him to reveal, about the methods and priorities that governed Moscow Center's operations. He provided fragments that seemed significant but compromised nothing essential, played the role of cooperative prisoner while cataloging the details of his confinement that escape would require exploiting. The escape came in September 1943, a walk away from German supervision whose success reflected either remarkable luck or calculation by captors whose purposes might have been served by releasing an agent whose return to Moscow would carry information the Germans wished transmitted. Trepper made his way through occupied France to partisan contacts whose assistance permitted eventual return to Soviet control, arriving in Moscow expecting recognition for service that had cost years of his life and the destruction of the network he had commanded. The recognition he received was not what service had earned. The system that could not use his intelligence could still punish him for gathering it, could still suspect that survival indicated collaboration, could still imprison men whose only crime was performing functions the system itself had assigned them. Leopold Trepper arrived in Moscow in January 1945, traveling through liberated Poland on trains whose smell of coal smoke and unwashed passengers reminded him of journeys taken decades earlier when he had first committed himself to the cause that the Soviet Union represented. He expected debriefing, the standard processing of returned agents whose operational knowledge required documentation before reassignment to new functions. He expected recognition, perhaps not public acknowledgement that clandestine work prohibited, but the internal honors that intelligence services provided to officers whose performance had been exceptional. He expected gratitude from a system he had served with devotion that personal cost had not diminished. He received Lubyanka, the prison whose basement cells had consumed generations of Soviet citizens, now consumed the spy master whose network had provided warnings that might have saved millions of lives, whose wartime intelligence had contributed to victories the system was celebrating, as it imprisoned the man who had helped make them possible. The charges were vague in the manner of charges that did not require specificity: suspicion of collaboration during captivity, insufficient vigilance in network security, the various categories of failure that could be constructed retroactively to justify punishment that required no justification in a system where punishment was its own purpose. 10 years. The sentence consumed a decade of Trepper's life in cells whose smell he had learned during his months of German captivity was universal, the odor of human beings confined beyond the limits that sanitation could address, of concrete that absorbed suffering and released it slowly into air that subsequent prisoners breathed. He was released in 1955, 2 years after Stalin's death had permitted the reconsideration of cases whose injustice had been invisible while the man who demanded injustice remained alive. He was not rehabilitated, he was simply released, expelled from a country he had served into an exile that took him eventually to Poland and then to Israel, where he died on January 19, 1982, 77 years old. His memoir published, but his service never officially acknowledged by the nation that had imprisoned him for performing it. Anatoly Gurevich's fate traced parallel paths through the same institutional machinery. His survival of German captivity, his participation in the Funkspiel under coercion that alternatives of torture and death had made irresistible, became evidence of collaboration that his service before capture could not outweigh. He returned to Soviet control expecting the processing that returned prisoners received, the verification of identity and debriefing of experience that repatriation required. He received 15 years in camps whose locations he was forbidden to know and whose conditions he would later describe with the precision of a man whose survival had depended on observing details that might provide advantages in environments designed to eliminate advantage. He was released in 1960, rehabilitated partially in acknowledgement that his confession to German captors had been extracted through methods that confession could not be said to have been voluntary. He spent his remaining decades in a Soviet Union that permitted his existence without acknowledging his service, that allowed him to live quietly without restoring the reputation that imprisonment had destroyed. He died on January 2, 1992, in St. Petersburg, 77 years old. His memoir published, but his service never officially acknowledged by the nation that had imprisoned him for performing it. Anatoly Gurevich's fate traced parallel paths through the same institutional machinery. His survival of German captivity, his participation in the Funkspiel under coercion that alternatives of torture and death had made irresistible, became evidence of collaboration that his service before capture could not outweigh. He returned to Soviet control expecting the processing that returned prisoners received, the verification of identity and debriefing of experience that repatriation required. He received 15 years in camps whose locations he was forbidden to know and whose conditions he would later describe with the precision of a man whose survival had depended on observing details that might provide advantages in environments designed to eliminate advantage. He was released in 1960, rehabilitated partially in acknowledgement that his confession to German captors had been extracted through methods that confession could not be said to have been voluntary. He spent his remaining decades in a Soviet Union that permitted his existence without acknowledging his service, that allowed him to live quietly without restoring the reputation that imprisonment had destroyed. He died on January 2, 2009, in St. Petersburg, 95 years old, the last surviving principal of the Red Orchestra. His memoir, published only after the system that had punished him had itself ceased to exist. Pavel Fitin's punishment was subtler than imprisonment, but no less complete. The man who had directed Soviet foreign intelligence through the war's most critical years, who had processed the warnings that might have saved millions if the system had permitted their use, was demoted in 1946 to positions whose obscurity matched the anonymity that intelligence work supposedly required, but that advancement usually overcame. He was assigned to provincial postings in Kazakhstan and the Urals, administrative exile that removed him from the centers of power without the dramatic punishment that might have attracted attention to failures whose responsibility extended beyond any individual officer. He died on December 24, 1971, in Moscow, 64 years old, his obituary appearing in newspapers that did not mention his wartime service or the warnings he had tried to transmit through channels designed to suppress them. Three men whose intelligence successes had been genuine, whose networks had gathered information that accuracy could not make useful, whose service had been rewarded with imprisonment, exile, and obscurity. The system that could not use what they provided could still punish them for providing it. Information without flexibility had produced agents who succeeded and suffered for their success, whose fates documented what happened when intelligence encountered institutions whose conclusions preceded analysis. The warnings had been accurate, the warnings had been ignored. The men who gathered them had been destroyed. This was what Soviet intelligence success meant for the men who achieved it.